I'm Wilson Miner, and I'm here at Build in 2009 talking about design and build and why a hybrid approach to those two is maybe a good thing for the web. So I'm Wilson, and since we're at a design conference called Build, I'm going to talk a little bit about design and build and why maybe a hybrid approach to both of those two things together is something that's appropriate and something that's positive on the web, and talk about some of the reasons why that is. So start with a question. What do you do? We've all heard this question. We've all answered this question. At a conference like this, it usually comes right before what's your name, right? What do you do? This is a very important question in our culture. So how many people, I know we just ate lunch, but I don't want you to strain yourself, but how many people, raise your hand, when people ask you this question, when you answer this question, how many people say, I'm a web designer? Raise your hands. All right. So we're at a design conference. It's a stupid question to ask. I get it, but you're there. So say web designer. How many people, at any point, somebody asks you that question, you've ever said you're a web developer? A few hands. All right. How many people at least thought about raising your hands both times? All right. Let's see. So it's a common sort of identity crisis in our industry. That's obviously an exaggeration. It's not really that big of a deal. But we have this question on the web, especially, I think, of what do we call ourselves? My answer to this question used to be, I make the internet, right? But that wasn't really that helpful. People didn't really respond that well. But we've had this sort of proliferation of titles in recent years. We can be interaction designers, be front-end developers, we can specialize in user experience or usability, all these different things. But still, with all these options, we have this question. What do we call ourselves? So the thing about the web is that I think makes this a little bit difficult is that on the web, what we do, what any of us does, tends to cross over any one of these sort of well-defined kinds of territories. So maybe I do a little bit of this, maybe I do a little bit of that, and that's just part of my job. And I think on the web, the web actually lends itself to that because these disciplines and the way we work are very closely integrated. So these things kind of merge together, and there's this blurry territory between these different things. And the web actually sort of lends itself to that. So, and I think this is particularly prominent at this particular intersection of design and development. So maybe this isn't really an identity crisis, right? Maybe this kind of crossover is actually the natural state of the web. This is sort of the way we're most productive. This is the way we operate in this industry. So how do we answer that question? How do we talk about what do we call ourselves? How do we, sort of pinpoint this sense of identity? So to get into that a little bit, we have to figure out where all these titles come from. Like where do all these options come from all of a sudden? So what we're really talking about is specialization. And the web is a growing industry, growing very quickly. And I think we see signs of that in lots of ways. But one of the things about a growing industry is that in any growing industry, you'll see a trend towards specialization. And, sort of the classic example to illustrate this is the Industrial Revolution, right? This is where this all comes from. One day you have a guy in a shop making shoes, right? He just makes shoes. And the next day, that guy works in a factory, and he punches he puts the wax caps on the ends of the shoelaces and hands it off to the next guy who punches the holes, and then he hands it off to another guy who actually threads the laces to the shoes. So there's this sort of division of labor that allows this higher level of production and this much more mature industry. So this by itself isn't really good or bad on its own. It's just kind of the way progress works, right? This is how we understand it. So how do we see this sort of pattern of progress, showing its face on the web? So take a very quick look back. So in the beginning, right, we just had webmasters, right? Does anybody ever call themselves a webmaster? You can raise your hand for that one too. So I think, even in this room, we're all still, part of the generation of the web that this is still a familiar idea to us. Maybe we were there, maybe this is something that we understand. And basically, there's this new thing, it's called the web, and you're the youngest guy in the room, you figure it out, and if it's on the web, it's your problem, right? That includes, making images or, figuring out the code or fixing the server, whatever. It's on the web, it's your problem. And as the technology and, the sophistication of what we understand and are able to do on the web starts to evolve, we start to see these things sort of split out a little bit. And it makes sense that, design and sort of programming and development are, they're clearly different things, and it doesn't necessarily make sense that the same person needs to do, both of these things just because it's on the web. So the guy who, at this point in history, the guy who's slicing up the web-safe images doesn't need to be the same person as the person who's writing CGI scripts, right? So these things sort of, we start to see this split. As the web continues to evolve, as our capabilities and the technology and the sophistication continues to evolve, all of a sudden, we're creating applications and experiences, not just documents and scripts, sort of stitched together. So we see this new opportunity and this new need for sort of functional front-end development. And this kind of discipline is much more closely related to development and to programming, but it's still very tightly integrated in with design in terms of defining the experience and how the user approaches and interacts with the site. And so as this functionality gets more complicated, site planning and, the design becomes more complicated, and we start to need, this sort of discipline of interaction design. We borrow from software, to deal with all these flows and, complicated states and things, without necessarily that having to be the same person who's worried about what color the buttons are or how big the logo is, or that kind of thing. So we start to see, these natural evolutions. And then as things start to fracture more, we also add in these sort of overarching disciplines, these sort of cross-functional specializations that find needs things like user experience and usability and IA and things that have their own backgrounds and their own, and sort of borrow from other fields and other disciplines that have their own specializations, like software and library science. And we're solving all of these same problems brand new all over again on the web. And we bring these things and they sort of wedge themselves in with all these functional roles that we've evolved naturally on the web. So the point of sort of going through this is that all this has happened before, and it will all happen again, right? No? Nobody? All right. I don't know how that slide got in there. But specialization isn't unique to the web. We didn't invent this. We think that we invented everything on the web, but we didn't invent this. It's just sort of embedded in our culture since the Industrial Revolution as the way progress works. It's sort of the hallmark of any mature, successful industry. But as we know, on the web, everything happens faster. So this evolution towards specialization has also happened relatively quickly in a compressed space of time, which is why we wake up one day and all of a sudden we have all these names that we can call ourselves and we're not quite sure which one applies. So I think in this rush to define ourselves within the model of what we see for what a mature, successful, highly specialized industry looks like, I think it's worth pausing collectively for a moment and sort of taking a look at where we are and where we're headed. So the faster we embrace specialization, both in the development of our industry and also, I think, in our own individual careers, the more likely we are to pass over what I think is an extremely valuable thing to sort of protect and preserve on the web, which is a hybrid approach. And this hybrid approach, for me, is embodied in this idea of a craftsman. Someone who works across specializations, someone who understands how all the pieces come together, and especially someone who cares about quality at every level. And I think, for the people who, decided to be here, the people who are in this room, this is something that we can recognize as being native to the way the web works and the way we think the web should work. So there's a particular way that I see this kind of evolution towards specialization impacting the web, sort of the landscape of the industry as we know it. And it illustrates why I think it's so important to preserve this sort of hybrid approach to design and development. And to illustrate that a little bit, I want to talk briefly about career paths. So there's a possible path on the web to being a web designer that doesn't involve any development experience, any real exposure to code. In the startup world and smaller teams, this isn't as common. We don't see this as much, but it's not unusual at all in big agencies. You have some guy, maybe he wrote some action script in 2001, but that's it, right? Like that's where it stops. And that's okay for him, right? He can be successful. There's a place and there's a valid path for him. There's also a perfectly valid path to being a web developer that involves no design experience and no real, exposure to understanding, principles of design. And I know we know these guys, right? Like maybe we are these guys. But it almost becomes a point of pride with some otherwise very talented developers who are extremely good at what they do, that they have no interest in understanding design, and they don't have to. And again, I don't point this out as something that's necessarily good or bad on its own. But what I do want to illustrate is that maybe it's not the norm, or if it is the norm, there are examples of sort of why it doesn't necessarily have to work this way. If you look at print design, for example, if you're a hotshot print designer with a lot of experience under your belt, chances are you got your start doing production work. So you come in entry-level position and you're doing pre-press work and color separations and really nitty-gritty stuff that nobody wants to do, so the new guy has to do it. Maybe you even went on press checks, these things where you actually physically go to the printer. Maybe it's in some exotic locale like Milwaukee, and you stay up all night and you watch the run come off the presses and you make sure that everything looks right. So the point I want to make about this is that you're actually going so far as to be physically present for the production of the object of this design. So you do your time and you pay your dues, but you also gain this fundamental understanding of how design actually gets made. This is part of your path. This is part of your path as a designer. You understand how ink goes on paper and how that impacts the results of your design. You sort of gain this deep understanding of the strengths and limitations of the medium that you're designing for. And now this isn't by any means the only path out there for a print designer, but I think it's a positive one. If you look at industrial design as another example, product design is even more extreme than print in terms of this sort of integration of design and production. So, work on my timing. Right? So, how a product looks is actually a direct function of how it's made. And the design of a product is just as much an engineering challenge as it is an aesthetic one. So everybody loves a good Apple design example, right? The original iPod, for instance, was the precise size and dimensions that it was because of two things: hard drive, and the battery. So Johnny Ive didn't come in and wave his magic design wand and decide that it should be that size. And there are certainly aesthetic criteria up front, and maybe they never would have made it if Toshiba didn't make that particular 1.8-inch hard drive at the time. But the design challenge wasn't how do we make this pile of components look good. It was how do we engineer it as elegantly as possible so it looks and feels natural. So in this example, it's not just a matter of designing within engineering constraints, right? Doing this sort of separate act that falls within these constraints that we're given. The design actually is those constraints. So this question of how does this thing get built is actually a fundamental question that we have to answer before or at the same time as what does this thing look like. Maybe you don't know the answer at the beginning of the process, but you know how to answer both questions, and you can sort of enter into this process of attacking both questions together and answering both questions together. So bringing this back to the web, it might be possible to be a web designer without any development experience. And it might be possible to be a developer without any design experience. So the paths may be separate, but the impact is inevitable. So it's impossible to be a web designer without having a significant impact on development. And it's impossible to be a web developer without having a major effect on the design. So there are very few other fields where this process of design and build are as closely integrated as they are on the web. Even more so, I think, than print or industrial design, because we're not talking about a process that ends in the the physical production of an object, which is somehow separate from the design. On the web, the code is the object, right? These things are so close together and tightly interwoven, these processes. So design and build are so close. And that point where they intersect is, I think, the most pivotal point in terms of determining the success or the failure of a design. So it's the fulcrum. If we can put just a little pressure there and really understand what's going on there, we can have a huge impact that sort of cascades through the whole project. This is a really important intersection of points for design, especially on the web. So what does this have to do with job titles, right? This is where we started. Are we designers? Are we developers? So what we're talking about is identity. And I've been talking up to now sort of about internal ways of understanding our identity based on what we do and how we work. But job titles are sort of funny in terms of their relationship to how we actually work. Because what we call ourselves, that's an external identity, and there's not always a direct link between our sort of internal understanding of how we work and how we represent that externally to the world and to people who maybe aren't embedded in our industry and how that works. But titles and what we call ourselves, they're how we communicate what we do to the rest of the world. So we can kind of dismiss them and joke about them and sort of say that they're not important to us because we understand and we, these aren't important. We say things like, I make the internet, or we have sort of made up titles that, prove how detached we are from this, segmented world. But I think they're important in the sense that they allow us to communicate sort of a shorthand version of this internal understanding that we have that we all understand and we all at least sort of agree on. So I talked a little bit about this sort of gap between our internal and our external representations of our identity. And I think if you look at the web from the outside, when you just look at job opportunities, you know, you're just looking at these titles and job descriptions and opportunities that are available for working on the web, and especially the most visible opportunities at companies whose names people have heard of. When you look at these job descriptions, excuse me, I think the landscape actually looks a little bit different than what we recognize. It looks like there are these certain well-defined slots that everyone fits in. So we have, if I'm a new designer starting out, I'm looking at the web from the outside, things like senior user experience designer or visual design lead or senior front-end developer. These are the kind of my targets. So my strategy as a designer starting out, if I think I'm smart, looks like this. I pick one of those slots. I make myself the best in the world at that one thing, and then I get the job doing that. So we're starting to see people who are coming to the web with their specialization already crystallized. They didn't start out in the webmaster days where, you know, they had to get exposed to a little bit of everything and sort of see what sticks and understand the whole process themselves. They came out of the gate as an interaction designer or a front-end developer or a usability specialist. And I think in terms of our internal understanding, we sort of instinctually understand that maybe it doesn't quite work that way. But we act like it does. And we act like it in the way we write job descriptions and the way we structure our teams and in what we call ourselves and sort of our job titles. And again, I want to point out, because this sort of has a negative bent to it, again, I'm not talking about this as something that's necessarily good or bad on its own. But I think it's something that we can look at and something we can be aware of and be conscious of the impact. Because when we're sort of going through these growing pains as an industry and becoming a more mature industry, when we're talking about these roles, we're not just talking about defining our own role and our own identity. We're sort of shaping what the industry looks like from the outside. And we're creating a template for what it will become. So it's important to sort of think about what that template looks like. And I think there's an example that's sort of interesting and possibly instructive that exists out there in a mature, successful industry that has embraced the benefits of specialization, but still has sort of a place for preserving this kind of hybrid approach to craftsmanship. And that example is in architecture. So before the 20th century, there really isn't a formal academic path in architecture. Instead, both the process of design and construction for building projects were handled by a master builder, right? And this is someone who serves as an apprentice for years before they, gain this title. They're sort of like the webmaster of architecture. So in architecture today, there's a term called design build, which refers to the sort of methodology that evolves from this sort of master builder idea, where the same company handles both the design and the construction of the same project. This isn't the norm at all in architecture. These are very different things, and they're usually handled by specialized firms, completely separate companies. And it's not entirely looked at positively within the architecture world. Design build is generally thought of as being sort of looked down on as something that's only for developer projects, which is a way to refer to things like condos and strip malls and depressing places like this. Places where design doesn't really matter in those kind of projects. There are certain innovative designers in architecture who have found that they can actually produce better results by interweaving the design and the construction phases. Even sometimes going so far as having architects physically work on site during the construction of building the project that they're designing. So what happens when you bring these two things together, design and build, is that you uncover these opportunities for efficiency and for innovation that are actually part of the construction process. So you take those problems and you open them up to design problem solving. And you're able to do that because you know how they work. And you know how they work because you're involved. Because as a designer, you're there all the way through the project. So the corollary for this on the web, I think, is this. Some of the most important design decisions happen in code. So I'll pause for a moment while you tweet that. We, as designers, we sort of have this mythology about ourselves that we're all the world's valiant problem solvers, and if everyone would just get out of the way and let us at their problems, we can solve them with the power of design. Well, you can't solve it if you're not there. We talk a lot on the web these days about user-centered design. We talk about testing and feedback and all these important things. But I think deep down, we understand the most direct way to create sort of so-called user-centered design is to be a user of the thing you're designing. And by this same token, if we want to really create truly innovative designs that take full advantage of the technology, which is so tightly integrated in our medium, if we want to do that, first we have to understand the technology. And the best way to understand the technology is to use it to build our own designs. Jim Coudal has a rule, and Ryan alluded to this too, but he has a rule where he says, hire the one who can write. So he's talking about hiring designers. He's saying that if he's looking at two equally talented designers, he'll hire the one who can write. And same thing, it's the sign of an organized mind. So I have a slight modification to this rule today, which I've been applying lately in terms of looking at two equally talented designers, and I'll hire the one who can write code. And the reason for this is it's the sign of a craftsman. The sign of someone who's curious about the work that they're doing, and someone who cares about quality all the way through the process. While I was working on these slides at an event apart in Chicago last month, some random guy in the audience, I don't know, the name starts with a Z or something, he said this: real designers write code, always have, always will. So his words, not mine. Whether or not you agree with that, why would he say that? Why would you think that? And I think it comes down to this idea that understanding the constraints of production allows you to stretch them. So you can make calculated leaps in your designs and not waste time hammering at boundaries that maybe aren't going to give no matter how hard you push. You can focus your effort in very particular ways because of that understanding that you have of the build process and how it works. And I don't think necessarily that this means that everybody should be writing code. There's definitely a place for specialization. And there are things that you can achieve with a highly organized, well-organized, highly specialized, large team that an individual in a small group just can never accomplish. But I think that it should be an assumption and not an exception that a designer who cares deeply about her craft should fundamentally understand and appreciate the tools of the medium. So this kind of hybrid approach to design and development, to craftsmanship on the web, is something that I think we as an industry should be actively sort of preserving and cultivating, even as we grow and move increasingly towards more and more specialization. So, assuming that we are looking at an industry landscape that's moving very quickly towards specialization, and assuming that at least some of us believe that there's room for a hybrid approach to integrating design and development, and assuming we believe that there's value to preserving that approach, how can we maximize our impact? It's very hard to change these kinds of, industry shifts and, attitudes from the top down, and maybe we don't want to. Maybe this is, really the path forward. But I think there are some things that we can do as individuals and as designers to both develop these kinds of hybrid skills and to use them to have a bigger impact no matter what the environment that we're in. From a big company where it may be more difficult, and even to small groups and by yourself where it's really just a survival skill. So I'll end here with a few hybrid survival tips and things that I've picked up along the way or learned the hard way trying to navigate these waters somewhere in the fuzzy space between being a designer and being a developer. There's no particular order, but I'm going to break them up into two groups for big teams and for small teams because they're very, very different environments for this kind of stuff. Big teams and big companies can be the most challenging places to exercise this kind of hybrid approach and to be a hybrid. There may, in fact, be no jobs at some companies that actually want you to cross over in this way. But I think if you recognize this and you understand how this works, you can turn what looks like a liability on paper into something that's actually a secret weapon. And the first one, learn to talk about what you do, not just what your job is. I think when you're working in this space, when you're working as a hybrid, it can get easy to sort of get bogged down trying to explain what you do and what you're good at, especially when your interests and your skills sort of cross over lots of different territories. And this can be especially difficult when you're interviewing for a job. So I think it's important not to let yourself be vague, be wishy-washy, to find a way to communicate honestly and clearly about your skills and what you're capable of, and to recognize that in some cases it's a risk for a manager to hire someone like you instead of someone who's sort of a clear-cut skills match on paper. They might be worried that someone who has more of a hybrid approach to this stuff, well, that you're not as passionate about this one particular thing that they need, or you're not as skilled as someone who's devoted their life to, just this one particular mode or language or whatever. So be sure that you can do the job that you're being asked to do, but be ready to sell them convincingly on why you can bring more to the table because of this kind of hybrid approach. Second one is find your leverage. So if you have a lot of diverse skills in your tool set, what skills can you lean into that will have the most impact in the particular environment that you're in? So in an engineering-heavy team, you can focus on being voice for good design and sort of bridging that gap by being able to talk about that in a way that relates to development. Or in a really design-focused shop, you can bring all these sort of development skills and understanding to the table, but relate those in a way that sort of speaks design language and sort of, you know, you understand how to present those things. So use your adaptability to focus your effort where it'll have the most effect. Earn respect, don't just ask for it. So it's all well and good if you believe, you know, designers should be writing code and this is the way the web works, but it's important to understand that engineers and managers will be skeptical of the designer writing code, especially in big companies. They've been burned before. So be ready to prove what you're capable of and sort of show what you can do. So recognize that buy-in is very important in large groups, and use your skills and use your adaptability to make those calculated bets. Be the voice of reason. Even if it's not in your area of direct responsibility, you can be the skeptic on new ideas. In design concepting, talk about whether the development effort is worth the result. With developers, talk about how an engineering choice will impact the design. This is a gross overgeneralization, but designers tend to oversimplify. Engineers tend to overcomplicate. You can understand both perspectives, so observe and adapt. And a couple quick points on working by yourself and in small teams. There's obviously a lot less resistance to this way of working when you're in a small team or on your own, because it's sort of an essential survival skill. There's still some traps to avoid, at least that I have failed to avoid in the past. Don't try to do everything at once. When you're working by yourself or if you're the only designer on a team, it can be tempting to take on everything all at once because everything is your responsibility. If you're the one creating the IA, doing the visual design, and the implementation, then all of a sudden all of those decisions are open to question at every point along the way because they're just yours. So you end up completely reworking the IA in the middle of Photoshop comps or completely changing the design while you're building it. And that's good. That's one of the big advantages of handling everything yourself, but it's really easy to get overwhelmed and just sort of freeze and not be able to move forward when the ground is always moving underneath you this way. So give yourself the luxury of segmenting out the steps a little bit and giving yourself space to focus on each one. Let yourself think like a designer when you're designing. Think like a developer when you're developing. Your instincts will come into play anyway, and you'll always second guess yourself, but at least try to tackle things in manageable chunks. Give yourself a challenge. This may sound counterintuitive after talking about trying not to get overwhelmed, but design something you're not sure how to build. In a bigger team, when you're handing designs off to another person, you tend to be much more conservative about pushing boundaries because it's going to be somebody else's problem to deal with. But when that person is yourself, you have a little bit more freedom to open up the reins a little bit and push yourself. So give yourself that challenge, and whether or not you pull it off, you'll learn something one way or the other. And as we've learned today, that's the most important thing. And finally, stay open to new ideas. When you are responsible for all the pieces, it's easy, especially for me, to put up a wall to any input that requires you to take on more. So it's easy to put up a wall against anything that doesn't fit the system that you've worked so hard to sort of carefully preserve. It's a necessary defense mechanism, especially when it's just you. But try to stay open. Create a place to shelve ideas as they come in and develop them later as the project evolves, and maybe you have, you know, a new opportunity to look at that idea fresh, but if it's not there, you've lost it. So what are we? Are we designers, developers, mutant hybrids? Whatever we call ourselves, we each have our own unique kind of combination of abilities and passions. We can sort of call these our default settings. This is the stuff, it's different for everybody, but this is the stuff that we're excited about doing and that we care about doing well, no matter what our job title says or what our job description is. And I think just in general, we spend a lot of time trying to tweak our settings away from the defaults in order to fit, the roles that we see out there for ourselves or for others, or what we think are the models for success. And we sort of try to tweak ourselves to fit those models for success. But how much more impact could we have if we can take at least some of that energy and put it into finding a way to lean into a direction that we're already passionate about, and to tune our environment and our situation to take advantage of what our natural tendencies and our natural instincts already are. How can we insulate ourselves from what we know are our weaknesses and our shortcomings, and to amplify our strengths? Even turning weaknesses into strengths by changing situation or what we're focused on or what our responsibilities are. So just like as individuals, the web has default settings too. This idea of crossover, agile thinking, iteration. As we mature and grow as an industry, we shouldn't just try to fit in the path that we think is out there for success, and the path that we see for other successful industries. I think we need to find a way to amplify the unique strengths of the web and insulate its weaknesses, but to do it in smart ways that are native to how the web organically works, and to find a way to lean in to sort of the natural state of the web. So maybe you're already on board with this whole idea in the beginning. Maybe none of this stuff I've been saying about design and code living together in perfect harmony, maybe none of this resonates for you. But maybe you're excited about another crossover between design and content, or editorial, or writing, or design and photography. Whatever that particular set, that particular crossover, whatever you're passionate about, try and find a way to lean into it.